The blood was fresh. Elara Voss noticed it the moment she stepped off the back porch, her boots sinking into the thin layer of snow that had settled over the yard just before nightfall. She had planned to check the creek trail for animal tracks, the way she did every Tuesday evening after work. She was a wildlife nurse, and the habit of watching the land around her cottage had become as natural as breathing. But she had not expected blood. Not this much of it. A dark trail cut through the white ground, leading away from the tree line toward the frozen ditch beside the old oak tree at the edge of her property. She followed it without thinking. Her flashlight caught the shape before anything else. Massive, gray, and completely still. For a moment, she thought it was dead. Then it moved. A low sound rose from it. Not a growl exactly. More like a warning from something that had no energy left to make a real threat. The wolf lifted its head and looked at her with pale yellow eyes that caught the light and held it, and Elara felt her heart drop into her stomach. It was the largest wolf she had ever seen outside of a photograph. Its thick gray fur was matted with snow and blood along its left hind leg. She could see, even from 5 feet away, the shape of a metal trap jaw that had snapped shut just above the ankle joint. Whoever had set it had used a heavy-duty model, the kind that had been illegal in this region for 11 years. The trap had not released on its own. The wolf had torn itself partially free, which was why there was so much blood. Elara stood completely still for 10 seconds. She was not a reckless person. She knew better than most what a wolf of this size could do to a person, even a healthy one. But she was also someone who had spent 8 years working with injured animals, and every part of her training was now overriding every part of her common sense. The wolf was not going to survive the night if the wound was not treated. That was simply a fact. She went back inside. She pulled on her thickest work gloves and grabbed her emergency field kit, the one she kept packed at all times near the back door. She took the tranquilizer kit as well, a lightweight dart system she had a license to carry. She filled a bowl with water and set a chunk of raw venison on a separate tray. Then she went back out. The wolf had not moved. She approached slowly, keeping her body low and her movements deliberate. She talked as she walked, not to the wolf but just aloud, keeping her voice steady and quiet. This was a technique she used with panicked animals in the clinic. The voice itself mattered less than the consistency of the sound. She set the water bowl down at a distance and stepped back. The wolf watched. It did not move toward the water. She waited. Then it lowered its head and drank. That told her something important. The animal was exhausted enough to accept water from a stranger. That meant it was also unlikely to attack unless she did something sudden. She spent the next 40 minutes working on the leg. The wolf snapped at her twice, neither time connecting, and both times she stopped, waited, and continued. She cleaned the wound, applied pressure where the bleeding was worst, and wrapped the leg with the bandaging she carried. She could not remove the trap entirely in the dark with the animal conscious. It would have to come out in stages. But she did what she could. She left the venison on the tray, and the extra bandaging supplies near the oak tree. When she finally stepped back and turned toward the cottage, she looked over her shoulder once. The wolf was watching her go. Its head was up, its yellow eyes clear and still. She went inside and stood over her kitchen sink for a long time without turning on the water. She went back the next night. She told herself it was to check on the wound. That was true. She also brought more meat and another bowl of fresh water, which was also a reasonable thing to do. The wolf was still there, in almost the same spot, its leg cleaned where she had bandaged it. She noted that the tray from the night before was empty. This time it let her closer without the snapping. She worked the trap loose that second night. It took a long time. The wolf held still through most of it, which was something she had never seen before in a wild animal under that kind of stress. She had worked with injured wolves at the Wildlife Rescue Center 2 counties over, and even sedated animals pulled away from the sensation of metal being pried off their bones. This one held still. It watched her face the entire time. When the trap finally gave and she lifted it away, the wolf exhaled, a long, slow breath that clouded in the cold air between them. She left fresh bandaging over the wound, applied a slow-release antibiotic gel she had brought from the clinic, and stood up. The wolf was already trying to put weight on the leg. She could tell it would be able to walk within a few days. She walked home with the broken trap under her arm and stood at her kitchen table, looking at it for a long time. The next morning, she filed an anonymous report with the Regional Wildlife Authority about the illegal trap. She described the location and the type of mechanism without mentioning the wolf by name or condition. She went back to the creek trail again that night and the night after that. By the end of the first week, the wolf was meeting her at the edge of the tree line instead of waiting at the ditch. It still did not come within arm's reach. It stayed at a distance that felt chosen rather than accidental, close enough to receive the food, far enough to remain on its own terms. She respected that. She understood it. She started keeping a journal. She wrote down the dates, the wound progression, behavioral notes, feeding responses. She told herself she was documenting a case study. She was very good at telling herself that kind of thing. What she did not write in the journal, because she had no language for it yet, was the feeling that came over her each night when she stepped off the porch and walked toward the tree line. It was not fear. She had moved past fear in the first few minutes of the first night. What replaced it was something quieter and harder to name, something that made the rest of the day feel like waiting. On the 9th night, she reached the tree line and stopped. The wolf was there, but so was something else. At the far edge of the clearing, where the spruce trees grew close and the shadows were thickest, there was a shape that was not a tree and not an animal. It stood upright. It was tall. It did not move when she turned her flashlight toward it, because whoever it was had stepped back into the dark just before the beam reached them. Elara stood with her heart going fast, and her flashlight aimed at the empty space between the spruce trees. Nothing. Just the trees. Just the dark. Just the sound of wind moving through bare branches at the ridge. She turned back to the wolf. The wolf was not looking at her. It was looking at the place where the figure had been. She noted this in her journal that night, in plain language. Unknown figure observed at north edge of clearing. Wolf tracking. Possible other observer in the area. Will watch. She set her flashlight on the kitchen table, went to bed, and stared at the ceiling. The wolf was still there. The wound was healing. She would go back tomorrow. That was enough for now. Elara first saw Calum Drave at the Tuesday market in the lower village, 3 weeks after the night she found the wolf. She was at the herb stall buying dried rosemary when she noticed him, not because he was loud or because he did anything to attract attention, but because of the exact opposite. He was standing near the fish counter on the far side of the market square, completely still, in the way that people who spend a lot of time outdoors learn to be still, and he was watching her. Not glancing, not looking away when she turned her head, just watching, with no particular expression on his face, as though he had been watching for some time and was perfectly comfortable continuing to do so. She looked directly back at him. He did not look away. He gave a small, unhurried nod. Then he turned and said something to the man behind the fish counter. She bought her rosemary and told herself to forget about it. His name reached her through the village, the way all information reached people in a small mountain community, gradually, in pieces, from multiple sources that did not know they were collaborating. The woman who ran the post office mentioned a new tenant at the old stone house at the end of Hollow Lane. The pharmacist said a conservation researcher had been asking about regional predator surveys. Old Marta, who sat outside the church on dry days and seemed to know everything that happened within 10 kilometers, simply said, "The Drave boy is back," in the tone of someone confirming a weather pattern. His name was Calum Drave. He was 34 years old. He had grown up in the region, left for university, and then fieldwork in the Northern Territories, and had apparently returned to conduct a study on the valley's wolf population. This was the official version. It was also, Elara noticed, a version that felt slightly too clean. Conservation researchers did not usually move into old stone houses and pay 6 months' rent in advance without a university or government body listed as their funding source. She did not know how she knew that detail. She had not asked. It had simply arrived. The second time she saw him was at the small grocery near the post office. She was reaching for a bag of oats when she became aware of him standing at the end of the aisle. She turned, and he was already looking at her, again without apology or explanation. He looked like a man who had spent a great deal of his life outside. There was a scar running from his jaw toward his left ear, old and well-healed, silver white against his skin. His hair was dark and slightly too long, and he carried himself with a quietness that she associated more with animals than with people. "You are the wildlife nurse," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "Elara Voss. That is right." She kept her voice level. And you are the researcher. Calum Drave. He did not offer his hand. She got the impression this was not rudeness, but simply a different set of habits. I have been meaning to introduce myself. I understand, you know this land well. I have lived here for 6 years. Then you have probably seen things most people who come through for a few weeks would miss. She looked at him for a moment. What kind of things are you looking for? He considered this in a way that felt genuine, not performative. Movement patterns, he said, particularly in the Creek Trail area, north of the Old Oak. Elara did not change her expression. She had become, over the years, a person who was very good at not changing her expression when it mattered. That is a good area, she said. Lots of wildlife passes through. So I have noticed, he said. She took her oats and left. That night she went to the creek trail as usual. The wolf came to the tree line at its usual time, a little before 9, and she fed it and checked the leg, which was nearly fully healed now, a rate of recovery that still surprised her each time she looked at it. She stayed for about 20 minutes. She was gathering her things when she had the feeling again. That particular quality of silence from the north tree line that was not empty silence, but occupied silence. She turned her flashlight on the spruce trees. Nothing. But the wolf was looking north again. She went home and wrote in her journal. She wrote everything she had observed about Calum Drave's knowledge of the creek trail and the oak tree. She underlined the phrase, movement patterns, and put a question mark next to it. Then she wrote, he knew my name before I told him. She stared at that line for a while. Then she closed the journal. 3 days later, a storm came in from the ridge. Not a blizzard, but serious enough that the temperature dropped 12 degrees in 4 hours, and the wind along the lower valley cut through anything thinner than a wool coat. Elara had gotten home from the clinic just ahead of the worst of it and was making soup when she heard the knock at the back door. She opened it to find Calum Drave standing on her porch with snow on his shoulders and no real expression of distress on his face, as though being caught in a mountain storm was simply a thing that sometimes happened and not worth treating as an event. The lane is iced over, he said. I cannot get the truck out until it passes. She looked at him. Then she looked past him at the storm. Then she stepped back and let him in. He sat at her kitchen table and accepted a cup of tea with his hands wrapped around the mug, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. The wind moved against the windows. The soup pot worked steadily on the stove. How long have you been watching the wolf? He asked. She turned from the stove slowly. What wolf? He looked at her. It was the same unhurried look from the market, patient and direct. The gray wolf, the one with the healed leg, the one you have been feeding at the creek trail for nearly a month. She set the spoon down on the counter very carefully. How do you know about that? She asked. I have been in the area for a while. That is not an answer. No, he agreed. It is not. She sat down across from him and put both hands flat on the table. The wolf's wound was on the left hind leg, she said. I never told anyone that. It is not in any report. I filed an anonymous report about the trap, not about the animal. I described the trap mechanism and the location. Nothing about the injury itself. She watched his face. So how did you know it was the left leg? Something moved in his expression. Not guilt, not calculation. Something closer to recognition. The look of a person who has reached a moment they knew was coming and has decided not to pretend otherwise. Because it was my leg, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. The soup kept working on the stove. The wind kept moving against the glass. Elara did not say anything. She looked at him. She looked at the scar on his jaw and at his hands, and at the silver quality of his eyes in the kitchen light. She thought about the wolf's pace of healing, which had been faster than anything she had documented in 8 years of wildlife work. She thought about the figure in the north tree line. She thought about the way the wolf had tracked something in the darkness she could not see. She thought about the fact that she was not, in this moment, afraid. Tell me, she said. He told her, not quickly, and not all of it at once. He started with the family history the way you start with the foundation of a building, not because it is the most interesting part, but because without it, nothing else stays up. The Drave family had lived in these mountains for 6 generations. Every generation had carried the same condition, passed through the bloodline without exception. It was not magic. It was not a story. It was biology of an unusual kind, documented within the family, over 200 years of careful record-keeping, never disclosed to the outside world, because the outside world had never shown itself capable of receiving that kind of information without turning it into something dangerous. The condition was real. It was inherited. It expressed under physical stress, under injury, under certain temperatures. And it was not, he was very clear about this, something he had chosen, or could turn off, or had any particular pride in. It was simply what he was, what his father had been, what his grandfather had been before that. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was finished, she got up and refilled his tea and stood by the window and watched the snow come down for a moment. "You could have told me," she said. "You would not have believed me. You do not know that." He was quiet for a moment. "You are right," he said. "I do not know that." She turned around. "Your leg, is it healed now?" "Yes." "Let me see it." He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise. Then he pushed back from the table. She examined the leg with the same focused attention she brought to every animal she had ever treated, and what she found was a healed wound that matched, in shape and dimension, every detail she had recorded in her journal about the wolf's injury. The scar was pale and clean. The tissue beneath was sound. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "You held completely still," she said. "When I was removing the trap, I have worked with injured wolves in clinic settings, under sedation, and they still pull away. You held still." "Yes. Why?" He thought about this for a moment. "Because you were careful," he said, "and because I trusted you." She stood up. She went back to the stove and stirred the soup. "You will stay until the storm passes," she said, "and then we are going to have a much longer conversation." "Yes," he said, "we are." Outside, the snow came down over the mountain in long, slow curtains, covering the creek trail, covering the clearing, covering the place where the tray had sat empty every morning for a month. Inside, the soup was nearly ready. Elara set 2 bowls on the table. She had stopped being surprised by herself a long time ago. She had always known she was not the kind of person who walked away. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was afraid. She had examined that feeling carefully and found it absent. What kept her awake was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and finally understanding how large it was. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind against the roof and thought about the wolf's yellow eyes and the way they had looked at her on the very first night, not like an animal in pain, but like something that was making a decision. Caleb had slept in the spare room. She had offered it without thinking too hard about it, which told her something about where her instincts had already landed. In the morning, the storm had moved east, and the lane was passable, and she found him in the kitchen with the stove going and 2 cups of coffee already made. He had found the coffee on his own, which meant he had moved quietly through her kitchen, without her waking, and she noted this, the way she noted everything, without alarm, with attention. He handed her the coffee. She took it. They sat at the table in the pale morning light, and she asked him the questions she had organized in the dark hours of the night, and he answered all of them plainly. He did not soften things or make them easier to hear. He told her about the trap, that it had not been an accident, that someone had set it in a place and at a time that suggested knowledge of his patterns, knowledge that only came from watching carefully over a long period. He told her he had known about the trap risk for several weeks before it happened. He had underestimated the timing. "Who said it?" she asked. "I have a strong belief," he said. "I do not yet have proof." "Tell me anyway." He looked at her steadily. "There is a family in the valley. They have been here for about 4 years. They go by Harwell now. That is not the name they were born with." He said the original name and she recognized it, distantly, from something Marta had once said in passing, one of those fragments of village history that she had filed away without understanding its significance. "Their family and mine have had a conflict that goes back 3 generations. It is not about money or land. It is about what my family carries. There are people who have always believed that what we carry is wrong, that we should not be allowed to pass it on. They have acted on that belief in every generation. This generation is no different." Elara held her coffee cup with both hands. "What did they do in the previous generation?" He looked out the window for a moment. "My father died at 41. The official cause was an accident in the high forest. There was no investigation." She set her cup down. "I am sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." He said it without bitterness, which told her it had been absorbed and carried, rather than forgotten. I was 12. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" He looked at her. "What? What do you need from me? You came back to this valley for a reason. You have been watching me since the first night I came to the creek trail. You let me treat you, which means you made a choice to be seen. That is not a small thing for someone who has spent years keeping this hidden. So what do you need?" He was quiet for a long time. "I am not sure," he said, and she believed him. "I think I needed someone to know. Someone outside the family. Someone who would not decide what it meant before they understood what it was. And you chose me. You chose first," he said. "You came to the creek trail. You came back 9 nights in a row." She thought about that. The figure in the north tree line, that was you. Every night. You were watching me. I was making sure you were safe. The Harwells know that area. I did not know if they had seen you with me. She processed this for a moment. And were they watching? "Yes," he said. "Not every night, but yes." She got up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the lane, which was gray and wet and perfectly ordinary in the morning light. A bird moved through the bare branches of the ash tree near the fence. 2 of her neighbor's dogs were running in the field across the road. She thought about her grandmother's old wooden box that sat in the back of the wardrobe in the spare room, the one she had never opened because her grandmother had pressed her hand against it and said not yet. One afternoon, when Elara was 11 years old. She thought about the way her grandmother had looked at the forest at the back of the property, sometimes in the evenings. That particular quality of looking that she had always thought was just an old woman's private peace. She thought, "Not yet. I need to go to work," she said. "I will be back at 5. You can stay if you want to. There is food in the refrigerator." She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "And this evening, I want to go up to the clearing together. I want to see where the Harwells have been standing when they watch. I want to know exactly what they have been seeing." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. Then he said, "All right." She went to work. She treated a red fox with a fractured shoulder and a barn owl that had hit a power line. She updated 3 case files and ordered new supplies for the clinic cold storage. She ate her lunch at her desk and looked out the window at the valley and thought about the shape of the old trap jaw and about the phrase, "My father died at 41, and about the word proof. She was back at the cottage at 5:15. Caleb was there. He had made dinner. She ate it without comment, and then pulled on her boots and her coat and her gloves, and they walked up to the creek trail together in the early dark with one flashlight between them, and she showed him where she had been setting the food trays and where the wolf had stood each night, and he walked the ground quietly and told her where he had been standing during those nights and why. At the north tree line, he crouched and brushed snow away from a patch of ground and showed her a boot print that did not belong to either of them. A heavy boot, wide tread, deep at the heel. Someone who stood in one place for a long time. Elara looked at the print for a while. "How many of them are there?" she asked. 2, he said. "A father and a son." She stood up. "Do they know that you know?" "They know, I suspect. They do not know that I have returned to the valley permanently. They may think the trap was enough to drive me out." She nodded slowly. "Then we have a little time before they realize it was not." He looked at her. "We." "Yes," she said. "We." She turned on the flashlight and walked back down toward the cottage, and after a moment he followed, and the creek trail was quiet behind them, and the dark above the valley was full of cold stars, and in the spruce trees at the north edge of the clearing there was no one. Not tonight. She did not know yet what she was going to do, but she knew she was going to do something. That much had been decided the moment she crouched in the snow beside a wounded animal and did not turn back. She had never turned back from anything in her life. Elara had known Marta Fell for 3 years. Marta was 76 years old, and she lived in the same house she had been born in, a low stone building with green shutters on the road that ran along the east edge of the village. She kept a garden that produced more vegetables than one person could ever need, and gave the rest away without being asked. She attended every church service and missed nothing that happened within the valley. She had a way of looking at people that made them feel both very seen and very calm at the same time. Elara had always liked her, but she had never gone to her with a real question before. She went on a Wednesday afternoon, 5 days after the night in the clearing. She knocked on the green door, and Marta opened it within seconds, as though she had been expecting someone, and stepped back to let her in. They sat in the front room with tea and a plate of biscuits between them, and Elara told her everything. She started with the wolf at the creek trail and worked forward from there. She did not leave anything out. It took 25 minutes. Marta listened without interrupting. When Elara finished, Marta picked up her tea and looked at the window for a long moment. "The Drave family," she said, not as a question. "You know about them," Elara said. "Everyone in this village knows about them," Marta said. "Or they knew. Once. It has faded over the years, the way things do when the people who carry the knowledge get old, and the younger ones do not ask the right questions." "What do you know?" Marta set her cup down. "I know that Calem's grandfather, Aldrich Drave, was a good man. I know that he built half the stone walls that still stand on the north side of the valley. I know that he carried the same condition that Calem carries, and that this was known to most of the families who had been here long enough to have seen it." She paused. "I also know that the Harwell family, they had a different name then, arrived in the valley the year before Aldrich died, and that Aldrich died in a way that was never properly explained. The same pattern as Calem's father." "Yes," Marta said it simply, without drama. Elara breathed slowly. Why did no one ever say anything? File a report? Push for an investigation? Because what would you say? Marta looked at her with a patient, direct expression. That a man who was sometimes a wolf was killed by people who disapproved of wolves? Even if the authorities believed you, which they would not, the disclosure would have destroyed what remained of the family. Aldrich's wife made the same choice. She stayed quiet, and she kept her children safe, and she carried the grief privately. Marta paused, the way women in that situation have always done. Elara thought about this. Then she said, "Marta, did my grandmother know the Drave family?" Marta looked at her for a long moment, a slow, considering look that went on long enough that Elara felt the blood in her ears. "Yes," Marta said finally, "she did." Elara set her cup down very carefully. "How well?" "Very well. For about 3 years, before she met your grandfather." Marta said it gently but without softening it. She loved Aldrich Drave. I think he loved her too. But he sent her away. He told her it was not safe. He was right, as things turned out, though I do not think he knew how right he was when he said it. The room was very quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece worked steadily. "She never told me," Elara said. "She was not the kind of woman who carried old grief in front of other people." Marta picked up the biscuit plate and held it toward her. She was, however, the kind of woman who kept records. That was when Elara remembered the wooden box in the wardrobe. "Not yet," her grandmother had said, pressing her small hand against the lid. She drove home in the early dark and went straight to the spare room. She took the box down from the wardrobe shelf and carried it to the kitchen table. It was not locked. There was no latch. It simply required knowing it was time to open it. She opened it. Inside was a small bundle of letters tied with cotton string, a dried flower that had gone brown and papery, 2 photographs, and a journal, smaller than a standard notebook, with a cover made of dark green cloth. She sat down and picked up the journal. The first entry was dated 54 years ago, late October. The handwriting was neat and young and confident. The last entry was 2 years later, and the handwriting shook slightly in the last line, as though her grandmother's hand had not been steady when she wrote it. Elara read every page. Her grandmother had found a gray wolf at the creek trail, in late autumn, with an injury on its left hind leg. She had gone back for 19 nights. She had fallen in love. She had been asked to leave for her own safety, and she had gone, though the going had cost her something she never fully named. The last entry read, "I should have been afraid. I was never afraid. That probably tells me everything about what I am, and what I should have done differently, and what I do not regret." Elara sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of her, and looked at the dried flower in the box, and at the photographs, one of which showed her grandmother as a young woman standing at the edge of a forest, laughing at something outside the frame, and one of which showed a tall man with silver-gray eyes and a particular way of holding himself that Elara recognized immediately. The eyes were the same. She called Calem. He answered on the second ring. "Come over," she said. "I need to show you something." He came within 20 minutes. She had the box on the table, and the journal open to the first entry. She watched his face as he looked at the photograph. She watched what happened in his expression when he realized what he was seeing. "That is my grandfather," he said. "Yes," she said, "and that is my grandmother." He sat down slowly across from her. "She found him at the creek trail," Elara said. "Same spot, same leg, 54 years ago." He looked at her. "She treated him," Elara said, "for 19 nights. She was not afraid either." She pushed the journal toward him. "You can read it if you want to." He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it on the table between them, and something moved through his face that she recognized. Not quite grief, not quite relief, but something that had the quality of both, something long carried being set down. "He never told me," he said quietly. "She never told me either." Elara folded her hands on the table. "I think they both thought they were protecting something. And they were, probably. But they also left us to start over from the beginning, without knowing we were continuing something they had already begun." He was quiet for a long time. "The Harwells knew about my grandfather and your grandmother," he said at last. "That is part of the reason they targeted my father, and now me. They believe the connection between our families is a pattern that needs breaking." "Then they are going to be very disappointed," Elara said. He looked at her. "I found something else in the box," she said. She reached in and lifted out a folded piece of paper from the bottom, beneath the letters. She had not read it yet. She had waited for him. She unfolded it now, flat on the table, and they both read it. It was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting, addressed to no one by name, dated 2 years after the last journal entry. It described the location of the original trap, different from the one Elara had found, but the same type, the same maker's mark. It described the Harwell family's original name and their pattern of behavior over several decades. It named dates and incidents and locations with a precision that told Elara her grandmother had been watching carefully long after she had been sent away. At the bottom of the letter, in the same slightly unsteady hand as the last journal entry, her grandmother had written, "In case it is ever needed, I hope it is not. I suspect it will be." Elara looked at Calum across the table. "She left us the proof," she said. He reached out and put one hand flat on the letter, very gently, as though it were something that might dissolve. "Yes," he said. "She did." Outside, the valley was settling into the deep quiet of a clear winter night. The creek trail was dark and still. The old oak stood in the cold with its arms bare. The box had been waiting in the wardrobe for 6 years, from the day her grandmother died, and the cottage passed to Elara. Not yet. Now. Elara did not rush. That was the thing that surprised people about her. The few times in her life when she had found herself in a situation that had edges and stakes and real consequences, she moved carefully. She did not act until she knew what she was doing, and why, and what would come after. It was the same quality that had made her a good wildlife nurse and a good observer of the land, and a person who had survived years of solitary work in difficult conditions without losing her sense of proportion. She did not confuse urgency with speed. She spent 4 days with the letter her grandmother had left. She read it multiple times. She cross-referenced the dates and names against public records she could access through the regional archive database from her laptop at the kitchen table. She found 3 incidents in the historical record that matched what the letter described, all documented under the heading of wildlife conflict or property dispute, none of which had been investigated past the surface level. She printed the records and set them beside the letter. Then she called the Regional Wildlife Authority and asked to speak with the senior inspector on illegal trapping cases. His name was Owen Farley, and he had a careful, methodical phone manner that she approved of. She explained that she had come into possession of historical documentation related to a pattern of illegal trapping activity in the valley. She described the trap she had found. She had kept it, bagged and tagged in her utility room, as she always kept evidence from illegal trap finds. She described the make and model and the GPS coordinates of the location. She did not mention Calum. She did not mention the Drave family. She did not mention wolves at all except in the context of potential victims. Owen Farley came to see her 2 days later. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a careful way of looking at things before he spoke about them. He spent an hour in her utility room examining the trap. He spent another hour at the kitchen table looking at the documents. He asked precise questions, and she answered all of them precisely. "This is well-organized evidence," he said, near the end. "I am a careful person," she said. "The family named here, the Harwells. They currently reside in the valley?" "Yes, they moved here 4 years ago. You can confirm the address through the local registry. I have not approached them, and I would not recommend doing so before a formal process is in place." He looked at her over the documents. "Have you had any direct contact with this family?" "No," she said. "I have never spoken to them." He nodded. He gathered the copies she had made for him. She had kept the originals, and stood up. "I will need to bring this to the Environmental Crimes Unit," he said. "The historical element makes it more complex, but the physical evidence you have provided is solid. The trap alone is a serious violation. The documentation of prior incidents adds a pattern that will be difficult to ignore." He paused. "This could take some time." "I understand," she said. "I am not in a hurry." He left. She stood in the doorway and watched his vehicle move down the lane. Then she called Calum and told him what she had done. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to. It means exposing your grandmother's letter, bringing her name into a formal process." "She wrote the letter because she wanted it used," Elara said. "She was very precise about what she wrote and what she preserved. She knew what she was leaving behind." She paused. "She spent 50 years waiting for the right moment and the right person. I think this is both." He did not answer immediately. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter. "My grandfather sent her away because he was afraid of what the Harwells would do to someone close to him." "Yes?" She went, but she stayed close enough to keep watching. "Yes?" Another silence. Then, "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know." Elara looked out the kitchen window at the back of the property, at the field that ran down to the tree line where the creek trail began. "You would have gotten along very well," she said. The formal process, as Owen Farley had warned, did take time. But it moved. The Environmental Crimes Unit opened a file. The trap was submitted as physical evidence. The historical documentation was reviewed and cross-referenced with existing records in a way that produced a paper trail long enough and consistent enough to be credible. The Harwell property was inspected under a wildlife protection warrant 3 weeks after Elara's initial report. Investigators found 3 additional traps stored in an outbuilding, all of the same illegal type. They found records of purchases that matched the trap mechanisms used in incidents going back 2 decades. The charges were formal and specific: illegal wildlife trapping, possession of prohibited hunting equipment, and, this was the part that took the longest but mattered most, a civil action connected to documented incidents of deliberate harm to protected species in a conservation area. The last charge carried real weight. It meant the Harwell family's access to protected land in the region was permanently revoked. It meant a substantial fine. It meant their name was in the official record in a way that would follow any future applications involving land, wildlife, or conservation in this region. They moved out of the valley 6 weeks after the charges were formalized. They did not say goodbye to anyone. Marta told Elara that the older of the two, the father, had looked diminished when she saw him loading the truck. Not beaten, not repentant. Just smaller than she remembered, as though something he had relied on for years had quietly stopped working, and he had not yet found another way to hold himself up. "Good," Elara said. Marta looked at her. "Yes," she agreed. "Good." Calum stayed. This was something she had not asked him to do, and he had not announced. He simply did not leave. He kept the stone house on Hollow Lane, and he was there in the mornings, when the valley was pale with early light, and he was there in the evenings when she came back from the clinic. Sometimes they ate dinner at her cottage. Sometimes they walked the creek trail at dusk, not because anyone needed to be fed or checked on now, but because the habit had become comfortable, and neither of them wanted to stop. The wolf did not come back to the clearing. She had known it would not. Once the leg was healed and the season changed, wild animals did not return to places where they had been vulnerable. She noted this in her journal without grief. The record was thorough enough. The case was good. She wrote it up formally in the spring and submitted it as a behavioral study, anonymized, focused on habituation and trust responses in injured wild canines. And it was reviewed by 2 university research groups and cited in both of their published papers. She did not correct anyone's assumptions about the source material. The journal stayed in the drawer of her desk. The wooden box went back on the wardrobe shelf, but she left the lid loose now. One afternoon in early spring, she was in the backyard turning the soil in the vegetable bed when she found, pushed against the fence post where the property met the tree line, a small flat stone. On top of it was a single gray feather and a small sprig of pine, still green, still fragrant. She picked up the sprig and held it, and looked at the tree line. Nothing moved, but the quality of the stillness was familiar. She knew the difference between empty quiet and occupied quiet now. She knew it the way she knew the difference between a calm animal and a frightened one. She carried the sprig inside and set it on the kitchen windowsill. That evening, she opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then she sat for a while with the pen in her hand. She thought about her grandmother's last entry, the shaking hand, the line she had turned over in her mind many times in the months since she had read it. She thought about what her grandmother had not allowed herself to write. She thought about the things she herself had been slow to say, not from dishonesty, but from the particular caution of a person who takes things seriously and does not want to name something before she is sure it is real. She was sure now. She wrote for a long time. When she finished, she set the pen down and read it back. Then she wrote one more line at the bottom, in the same place her grandmother had written hers. She wrote, "I should have been afraid. I was never afraid. That probably tells me everything. But unlike her, I am not going anywhere. I know what this is, and I know what I want it to be, and I am staying." She closed the journal. Through the kitchen window, the light was going low and gold over the valley. Caleb's truck was in the lane. The vegetable bed was turned and ready for seed. The pine sprig on the windowsill was still green. She got up and started dinner. Outside, the creek trail ran through the trees in the last of the evening light, quiet and unhurried, carrying meltwater down from the ridge, the way it had for longer than anyone in the valley could remember. The old oak stood at the edge of the property with its arms beginning to bud. Somewhere up in the high forest, where the spruce trees grew close and the snow held longest, something moved through the shadows with ease and without fear. It had been watched over. It had been healed. It had been let go. That was the right order of things. Elara knew that now. She had always known, somewhere underneath the practical thinking and the careful documentation and the sensible boots and the emergency field kit packed by the back door, that the most important things in a life were rarely the things you planned for. They were the things you walked toward in the dark, not because you were reckless, but because turning back was never really an option for the kind of person you were. She had walked toward the creek trail. She had walked toward the wolf. She had walked toward the truth of what she found there, and toward the man who carried it, and toward the history her grandmother had tried to protect her from, and had also, at the very end, tried to give her. She had walked toward all of it with her flashlight and her field kit and her open hands. And the thing she had fed, on all those cold and quiet nights, had never been just a wolf. It had been trust, and patience, and the slow, careful beginning of something. Neither of them had known how to name until it named itself. The door opened. Caleb came in from the lane and hung his coat on the hook and looked at her across the kitchen with the evening light behind him. She did not say anything. She handed him a knife and pointed at the carrots on the counter. He smiled, a real one, the kind she had learned to watch for because it was rare and genuine, and changed his whole face, and he picked up the knife and started to work. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the valley was settling into the long blue quiet of a spring evening. There was nowhere else either of them needed to be.